Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to the EMA FVE webinar on conditions for using certain antimicrobials under the cascade. My name is Zoltán Kunsági. I am the head of Veterinary Antimicrobial Monitoring and Resistance Service at the European Medicines Agency, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's event. This is the 7th activity organized jointly by the EMA and the Federation of Veterinarians of Europe, FVE, to raise animal health professional awareness on key topics related to the implementation of the veterinary medicinal products regulation. This webinar, the 4th on the critical topic of antimicrobials, is a follow-up to the EMA FVA info session on the use restrictions for certain antimicrobials in animals held in May 2024. In 2020, the European Commission requested from the agency a list of antimicrobials in which, and now I quote, the use of certain antimicrobials under Articles 112, 113, 114, cascade use, may not be allowed or be subject to certain restrictions in order to help preserve their efficacy for humans and or animals. This is such a long request. After the agency delivered this advice, the European Commission published in July 2024 the Implementation Regulation 2024-1973, establishing a list of antimicrobials which shall not be used in accordance with Articles 112 and 113 of Regulation 2019/6, or which shall only be used in accordance with those articles subject to certain conditions. In today's event and in our capacity as regulators, we will focus on the conditions for the use of certain antimicrobials under what is commonly known as the cascade. Our speaker, Professor Rory Brunach, Dean and Head of the University College Dublin School of Veterinary Medicine, will talk about the veterinary prescription cascade, the use of antibiotics and recommendations, and present takeaway messages for veterinarians. After the presentation, which will take around 30 minutes, participants will have the opportunity to engage and ask questions via Slido. Okay, thank you, Katarina. So you can access the platform either via www.slido.com and typing the events code available at the bottom right of each slide. You can also access the platform by using your smartphone. Just point the camera at the QR code. Okay, just before we start and I give the room to the president of FVE for the opening remarks, a bit of housekeeping. If you experience audio issues, leave the meeting and log in again. Make sure you selected the correct audio outputs. All attendees are muted by default. Please note that this session is being recorded. By participating, you consent to this recording. If you do not agree, we kindly ask you to exit. The materials shared today will be uploaded on the events webpage in the upcoming weeks, together with the session's recording. Okay, so now without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Piotr Kwieczynski, President of Federation of Veterinarians of Europe, for his introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoltán. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear veterinary colleagues, it is with great pleasure to be here with you today on behalf of the Federation of Veterinarians of Europe, welcoming you all to this jointly organized webinar with the European Medicines Agency. FVE throughout our members represents around 330,000 veterinarians from 39 European countries. This is the 7th joint webinar, as Zoltan mentioned, the European Medicine Agency and FVE are organizing. And we cannot underline enough how much we thank the European Medicine Agency for the opportunity to work together, shoulder to shoulder, on supporting veterinarians to have safe veterinary medicines available to treat their patients. This webinar is on extremely important topic for every veterinarian, but specifically for practitioners, naming the use of cascade and restrictions of using certain antimicrobials under the cascade. Due to the fact that there are many animal species, it is often not commercially viable for pharmaceutical companies to authorize veterinary medicines for minor species, such as geese, for example, ducks, rabbits, fish, and other, or roughly say, small markets. This means that veterinarians lack authorized veterinary medicine for certain species or certain indications. And then the cascade is our safety net. The new medicines legislation, from one hand side, give us more flexibility, but it also make it more complex to use the cascade. So that is exactly why we organize this webinar. To give an overview of cascade use under the new medicines law, and specifically which restrictions apply when you use certain antimicrobials under the cascade rules. In a second, you will hear a presentation, and after the presentation, plenty of time will be left for your questions or feedback. I encourage all of you to actively take part and ask questions using Slido. I assure you that every question is important for us and will contribute to the discussions. Your diverse experience and perspective enrich the dialogue and contribute to the overall success of this webinar, because this webinar is organized for you and for better understanding for all of us. Thank you very much for your participation, and I wish you a productive and enlightening webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Piotr. Next, we'll hear from our first speaker, Professor Rory Branagh, who will talk about the veterinary prescription and the conditions for using certain antimicrobials under the cascade. Rory, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zoltan, and also thank you, Piotr, for your opening remarks. As you point out, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. This is a very collegiate exercise where we want to try and actually help each other, not only to understand why and what, but also how we're going to actually use this at a practical level within the field. So I'm delighted to be here. When I asked the agency, what do you want me to say? I said, say whatever you want, just say it slowly, okay? So I'm very much aware that being Irish, I do tend to talk quite quickly, and therefore I'm going to make every effort to try and actually reduce the pace so that everybody can hopefully follow. So just to give you an overview, and Piotr made a very important remark there. He said that for many veterinarians, the cascade has been the safety net, and that is true. We have had a lack of availability in many different areas of veterinary medicine, and the cascade is a safety net. And as a clinician myself for over 30 years, I've had to use the cascade and been very glad that it was there. So I think it's really important to point out at the beginning of this talk, when the people took part in this exercise, the whole point was to try and explain to you why we had to take certain actions in certain cases and why we chose not to take actions in other cases. But at the back of our mind always was the issue of availability, but also trying to make sure that through good, prudent use and stewardship, we could more or less ensure that any actions taken under the cascade would not promote the development of resistance. So that's the common goal. We all have this common goal that we're trying to reach, which is that we maintain the efficacy of the antimicrobials available to us. So the structure of the presentation is going to be as follows. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call the cascade. Now, I do need to point out that in the new regulation, the word cascade is never used. And we refer to different articles, articles 112, 113, 114, and 115. And that is the legal mechanism. But at the same time, I do understand that in common parlance, the word cascade is used. So I'm using it, even though whenever I use it in this talk, I'm actually referring to articles 112 and articles 113. Then I want to talk about the use of antimicrobials and the recommendations that we put in place. And I'm glad to say that for so many families, there was no need to have any restriction on use. But for a smaller number, we did need to put certain conditions in place, although we did not ban the cascade use of any of the families. Then at the end, we want to look at the key takeaway messages. And as Piotr pointed out, we're really keen in the Q&A session to try and address some of the key concerns you guys have, particularly at field level. Because again, if you're in a smaller member state or if you're dealing with minor species, I obviously am totally aware of the fact that you do face challenges in trying to bring about the best form of care for your patients and for your clients. So the veterinary prescription cascade, what is it? So we need to be very clear. It's recognized by everybody, including the Commission, the agency, and all of our colleagues in practice, that a lot of us face difficulties when there is no authorized veterinary medicinal product for a particular disease and a particular species in your country. And that, of course, is a bigger issue for people like me when you deal in a small member state like Ireland, but many other people are in small member states as well, where simply for commercial reasons, companies choose not to market their product. So we have got an availability issue. The problem is even more complex when we look at limited markets and minor species. So for those colleagues dealing with goats and other minor species, you can actually find there is a complete paucity of authorized medicines. And therefore, you're relying on some mechanism to give you access to allow you to do your job. So in the new veterinary regulation, the safety net is commonly referred to as the cascade. But as I said to you before, I'm really going to refer to articles 112 and 113. And what it does, it gives you that safety net, but it does come with restrictions. So it's not a free-for-all where under any situation you could choose, I'm going to use the cascade. You must satisfy certain criteria. And in order to do that, it's a very logical step-by-step approach, which we're going to go through. And the beauty of it is it tries to actually give you prudent use principles, but at the same time, it tries to give you access to medicines and availability to treat the diseases that you're trying to do. So what we're talking about when we say the cascade, we're talking about a set of rules that guides you on how to use medicines when there is no authorized veterinary medicinal product for that species or for that indication. And it is challenging, but these are the rules that in order to stay within the law, you do need to follow. So the cascade, first and foremost, we hope that we're in a very beautiful, unique position where we've got a specific infection in a specific breed or in a specific species, and there is an authorized product. But let's take a real world scenario where there is no EU authorized veterinary medicinal product for use in that species for that indication. The first port of call that you have to look at is you've got to look for another EU authorized veterinary medicinal product. So it could be in your own country or in another member state. We're dealing with this as an EU community, not just at national member state level. And you pick a veterinary medicinal product which is authorized either in that species or another species for the same or even for a different indication. And when you actually read that, that's a very broad outlay. There's a number of products which you could use from a different species or for a different indication, which may be authorized in Germany or Spain or Sweden. So actually, when you do interrogate the Union product database, there's actually quite a number of products out there. So you're not being left on your own. If, however, that you actually trawl through the European product database and you find that there is no authorized veterinary medicine in any animal species for any indication which will meet the condition that you're faced with, then you can look and see, is there an EU authorized human medicinal product? Clearly, it won't have the same indication because we're dealing with a different species here, but this is access not just to human products in your own country, but also again on a pan-EU member state basis. Still then, if there's nothing, you're faced with the opportunity to make up an extemporaneous veterinary medicinal product. Now, this is one that you make up yourself at the time and under your own responsibility. And this is quite commonly done in practice when, for example, you need a topical medication, but none is available. You might take an injectable formulation and make it up into a topical preparation. But that extemporaneous preparation has been made under your responsibility. If then that's not possible, you come to the last step of the cascade. And that is to look to see if there is an authorized veterinary medicinal product in a third country with the same species and the same indication. Now, when you read that, guys, this is a little bit more restrictive, okay? The veterinary medicinal product must be authorized. Secondly, it must have the same indication in the same species. So it's not as generous, for example, as step one, where you could use an EU authorized product that was maybe authorized for another species or another indication. Just to point out, this does not relate again to immunologicals or vaccines. This relates again to pharmaceutical products. However, although it looks like we're trying to solve the problem, some rules have to apply. The first is very simple. You have to take responsibility for this. And sometimes that means, for example, when you come to setting a withdrawal period, and there's no withdrawal period in the SPC because it's a cascade use, you've got to set a responsible and prudent withdrawal period. So you do this under your own responsibility. And the other thing to understand is it's not a free-for-all. Some vets tell me that when they use the cascade provision, they're using it once a week or twice a week. Because when you read the legislation, what we talk about is using the cascade to avoid unacceptable suffering and in exceptional circumstances. So if we're honest, if somebody's using the cascade procedure 10 times a day, every day, that is not in line with the regulation. You need to use it to avoid unacceptable suffering, and it needs to be exceptional circumstances. It's not, as I said, a simple free-for-all. So we're just going to have two kind of infographic slides now. One related to companion animals, because this is what's covered by Article 112. And the next slide then deals with food-producing species, which is covered by Article 113. So at the top of the infographic, you see if there's an authorized veterinary medicinal product for that species and that indication. If so, you're obliged to use this. And this is one common misconception with the cascade. People say, well, I know there is an authorized medicine for that indication in that species, but I don't like it. I prefer something else that's available, say, in cattle or in pigs. That's not allowed under the cascade. If there is an authorized product, you have to follow the SPC for that product, and you are obliged to use that authorized product. You can't simply try to invoke the cascade to get away from that. But if there is no authorized medicine, in that case, again, under exceptional circumstances, to avoid unnecessary suffering, and under your responsibility, the next step, or step one within the equation is there another veterinary medicine that is authorized within the EU for another species or another indication in that species? If so, that is the next port of call, and you're expected to use that product. If not, then you can interrogate the human market and find, is there a medicinal product that's authorized for human use, either in your own country or in another member state? If so, you're obliged to use that. And if unfortunately you're getting a bit more desperate at this point, there's no veterinary product and there's no human product, and again, I specify authorized products. If not, you ask yourself the question, can you make up an extemporaneous preparation? If so, you use that. And finally, if all else fails, then you can seek to see, can you access a authorized veterinary medicine from another third country? And just for the purposes of this talk, to be clear, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein are not third countries. They are not considered to be. Switzerland is a third country, as of course would be America or Australia or Japan. Unfortunately, on a small number of occasions, despite all these safeguards and get out of jail cards, you might well find that there's still no product that fits your need, in which case you are left with a bit of a nightmare scenario that there is no treatment available to legally treat that particular case. In the case of food-producing species, it's just a little bit more complex because there's an extra step that you have to take. Article 113 deals with food-producing terrestrial animal species. It's not dealing with aquatic, it just deals with terrestrial. So you start out again at the top and find, is there a product that is authorized in that species for that indication? And if so, just to repeat, you are legally obliged to use that product. If not, the next step is to try and find another veterinary medicinal product which is authorized for a food-producing species. And that's the key thing, because now MRLs will exist. So is there another authorized product for food-producing species, either in your state or another member state, but it could be in any food-producing species for any condition? If no such product exists, you can then look at using an authorized product for a non-food species. So again, maybe a product authorized in the dog or the cat. However, the caveat here is it must be in your member state and it must be for that same indication. So that is slightly more restrictive. It's giving you access to non-food products, but they must be in your own member state, and they should actually be also authorized as well for that same indication. If no such product exists, you can then see if there's a human medicinal product. And again, it's quite open. It could be in your country or any other EU member state. If that's negative, then you have to go and see, can you go to an extemporaneous step? And if that's negative, again, we go to a third country. but it must be the same species and the same indication. So there is a lot of overlap between both companion animal and food-producing species in Articles 112 and 113, but there is that extra step and extra safeguards needed for food-producing species, simply, of course, on the basis that we have to protect the consumer. So then we get specifically going away just from the cascade in general into the use of antimicrobials and the exercise that we were asked to do. And as Zoltan pointed out, we're all familiar with the fact that a previous exercise created this human reserve list. That was the Article 37 advice given to the Commission, which came out in a regulation in 2022. And just to reiterate, none of the molecules which appear on the human reserve list can ever be used in veterinary medicine, whether as an authorized or whether under the cascade. So they're completely and utterly confined to human use. However, in this second exercise, whenever we have the new regulation that came into force last year, although there is a lead-in period before it becomes legally enforceable at community level. And this was again based on the advice where we were asked, are there any antimicrobials or substances that should not be used under the cascade, should only be used under certain conditions within the cascade? So the two lists are complementary. You've got a banned list, which is the human reserve list, and then you have a second list, which may be those that if they are going to be used under the cascade, certain conditions may apply. So just to very quickly go back over the human reserve list. As you know, this was a very time-consuming exercise because people want to get it right. A lot of vets were concerned that numerous antimicrobials would appear on the banned list that would really restrict their ability to do their job. The good news is when you look at what happened, there were 11 antibiotic classes and 6 individual antibiotic substances, combined with 18 antiviral substances which went on the human reserve list. Now, as I said before in a previous presentation to FVE, when you actually look at what's on those lists, okay, nobody wants a situation where you're told you cannot use something. But the truth of the matter is, as most of my colleagues told me, either they hardly ever use them or they never even heard of them. So the truth of the matter is that the human reserve list, in my opinion, has not really restricted veterinarians from doing their job. But we need to be conscious that that list does exist. So then we come to Article 107, which was the second follow-up scientific advice requested by the Commission. And Zoltan outlined the letter that was sent to the European Medicines Agency. And again, it's got a very simple background to it. So to help preserve the efficacy of antimicrobials for humans and our animals, was it necessary to actually look at all the remaining antimicrobials that were not on the banned list and see, should they not be used under Articles 112 and 13? In other words, no cascade use, or should they be permitted for cascade use, but only with certain conditions applying? So behind the development of the e-advice, because one thing we really want to make clear, under no circumstance did a group of people sit around a table and just arbitrarily decide, let's restrict this, or let's put a condition on that. It was a very, again, time-consuming exercise because we wanted to get it right. And at the back of our mind always was, we want to address antimicrobial resistance, but we don't want to make availability an even bigger issue for vets in practice. So there are 5 criteria which are outlined in the Commission's request. The first criterion was criterion A, and that was that we would explore the risk to animal or public health if that antimicrobial was used in accordance with the cascade. And a lot of this related to safety. In other words, what would be the safety for the target animal species, and what would be the safety for the consumer from food-producing species? We didn't look at environmental safety or user safety, but it was largely safety related. The second criterion is what would be the risk for animal and public health if, in fact, the use under the cascade led to the development of resistance, because, of course, this is the one thing that we're all trying to avoid. Criterion C was the availability of other treatment options for animals for that specific infection. Criterion D was the availability of other antimicrobial treatments for humans. Now, you can see the difference between C and D. In the case of animals, we were asked other treatment options, not just antimicrobials. So we're looking again at things like vaccination, would there be a national eradication program, all the things that we do to try and control animal diseases that wouldn't require the use maybe of systemic antimicrobials. Clearly, when it comes to humans, you can't depopulate or use eradication programs, although we may at times wish that we could. And then finally, criterion E. Even if we saw that there was a risk, we saw that maybe this might promote the development of resistance to some degree. What would the knock-on impact be on aquaculture and farming if, in fact, we did restrict cascade use? What would that impact be for animal health animal welfare and animal production. So what I hope you can see here, guys, is across the 5 criteria, we're trying to get a balanced picture. We were not going to one extreme over the other. We were looking at all sides of the equation. The next thing then we had to look at was, having done those criteria, is, well, what are the routine avenues of cascade use? I mean, what does it involve at field level? And in that case, what conditions could we apply, which could really address the real life practical use of some of these antimicrobials? So we've got 5 different circumstances that we investigated. The most obvious one, of course, is that we would be dealing with unauthorized indications and obviously unauthorized animal species. But in addition to that, you might be dealing with a route of administration or a formulation that, again, was not authorized, something that we'd made up ourselves in, say, an extemporaneous preparation. We also had to look at the use of human medicinal products and, of course, the use of third country veterinary medicinal products, even though, as I said, we were not looking at vaccines. So there are kind of 5 common circumstances for cascade use, and then we had to consider what conditions could realistically be applied in that case. So the criteria behind the development was as follows. The criteria that we just talked about, A down to E. The second thing were the certain conditions that we could apply based on the circumstances of use. But there was a third pillar, and that were the legal constraints. So for example, when we came to look at a particular antimicrobial, if we were looking at the potential to use in food-producing species and no MRL existed, well, that was a stop straight away. There was no question that you could allow cascade use for a product in food-producing species if, in fact, there was no MRL. The second thing is we were told and advised by the Commission to restrict our exercise to Articles 112 and 113. So we were looking again at companion animals and food-producing species. Article 114 are food-producing aquatic species, and Article 115, I think it's Section 6, that deals with the list of essential substances for equidae. And on that list, there were certain antimicrobials. So this essential list for equidae, of course, was products which were considered necessary for the treatment of equidae or those that gave added clinical benefit. And in order that the exercise would actually make sense, what we were asked to do was don't deal with aquatic and don't deal with the essential list for equidae, because they're 2 separate procedures that are ongoing. And at the end of the day, when those articles are finished, the advice taken on board and the implementing acts adopted will update the regulation. So the regulation at the moment really just relates to 112 and 113. It's not looking at food-producing aquatic species, and it did not look at the essential list for equidae. So just to explain that background to you. The summary of the process then, just very, very quickly. We started out, first of all, looking at all classes that were initially assessed against the legal constraints. Things like, is it on the equine list, or does it not have an MRL status? If not, we went to step 1. And step 1 was to evaluate against the criteria B, C, and D. And just to recap, that is, what's the likelihood of resistance developing if you do use it under the cascade? What are the alternative treatments available in veterinary medicine? And what are the alternative antimicrobials treatment available for humans? The good news was that for so many molecules, which we'll show a slide shortly, we found that there was no significant risk of the development of resistance, or alternatively, there were a large number of alternative treatments available. And therefore, there was no reason to restrict or put conditions on cascade use. However, for some molecules, there was evidence that maybe resistance would be promoted, or there was a lack of other alternatives, or maybe just a small number of alternative treatments available. So then we had to consider the conditions that we could apply based on the circumstances of cascade use. That led on to step 3 then was to evaluate those remaining antimicrobials against criteria A, the impact on human and animal health if they are used under the cascade, and criterion E, what would be the impact on aquaculture and farming if in fact no treatment were made available. So that led then to the final conclusions. Bearing in mind criterion A and criterion E, did we need to put any conditions on the use, or did we need to restrict that use? Now, one thing we want to be very upfront about were the challenges. So clearly, as you all understand, there were many data gaps. The first data gap, of course, was that nobody has a real handle on what is the level of cascade use out there within the European Union. So we just didn't have data on the types and extent of antimicrobial use outside the terms of the marketing authorization. The second gap was the study gap, and that was the lack of reliable published data on the efficacy and safety of those antimicrobials when they're used under the cascade, because we don't have target animal safety studies and we don't have clinical trials. The third gap was the information gap. And that is that there's very little information out there on the true level of resistance, A, within the European Union, and what level of resistance has been promoted by cascade use. And finally, of course, we have an evidence gap in that a lot of cases we don't even know the true burden of animal disease within the EU. So against that background of those 4 serious deficits in our knowledge, you can understand it was not an easy exercise to undertake. How did we try to address this? Well, we looked at 6 key areas where maybe we could get information. First of all, as you're all aware, there are many existing categorizations and recommendations for antimicrobial stewardship. They may come from the EMA categorization, they come from the World Health Organization, they come from the World Organization for Animal Health. So we didn't ignore those, we looked at those. We then hit the books, we hit all the published literature, we looked for peer-reviewed papers, textbooks, treatment guidelines. We did a survey where there was an open call for data, where we asked veterinarians, what are you using and why are you using, to give us some information on what's happening down at field level. We looked at a lot of the white stuff, such as the official reports and surveillance data. We looked at more than 700 references, and that took a huge period of time. And finally, then, all of this was assimilated by 13 experts, or if I'm honest, 12 experts plus me. And of course, they were all veterinary sector specific, coming from different areas, production animal, companion animal, maybe experts in antimicrobial resistance pathways, all that kind of stuff. We really tried to get the best knowledge information around the table. So what was the end result? Well, the first bit is the good news. If you look there on screen, you will see so many of the commonly used antibiotic families, even in the case of antivirals, antifungals, and antiprotozoals, where we did not put any restriction on cascade use. It's not banned. There are no conditions attached. And again, a lot of what's there on the left-hand side would be kind of AMA category AMA category D, C, and B. Okay, so in so many cases, for example, vets still in the field are able to do what it is they want to do. In the case of the antivirals, remdesivir was the only one that we put a restriction on, because in that case, we did want to restrict it purely for the treatment of FIP. In the case of the antifungals, all the common families of the azoles, whether you're using, miconazole, itraconazole, there is no restriction on use. And again, for the antiprotozoals, most of the common ones that were used, you will see, had no conditions attached. But at the end of the exercise, when we did consider the 5 criteria that we were asked to consider, it was clear that for 9 antibiotic classes, 2 antifungal, and obviously remdesivir is the antiviral, it was necessary to put in place some conditions on cascade use in order to ensure prudent use and try and stymie the development of antimicrobial resistance. You can see as you go then along up on top in the green box, whatever, we outline exactly what the restriction is. The most common one coming forward, of course, would be target pathogen identification, followed by susceptibility testing. And although this adds another cost and obviously takes time, there is no doubt that the use of target pathogen identification and susceptibility tests is one of the key things that will help to drive down the development of AMR. In other cases, we looked at, did we need to restrict around certain indications or just restrict to certain indications? So for example, were we only going to allow an antimicrobial to be used for MRSA or MRSP rather than a wide range of conditions? Also, we had to look in a small number of cases at restrictions to certain species. We had to look at use in individual animals only. And of course, some other conditions again applied to the use of human medicinal products. But when you look at that table, okay, if you actually really digest it, other than the need for pathogen identification and susceptibility testing, a lot of the conditions really do not impact what is currently in place in veterinary medicine, and certainly there are other alternatives available to you. So the belief of the group was that we had struck this correct balance between steps that we needed to take to stop the development of AMR, and yet steps that did not truly reduce availability to an issue that you couldn't actually do the job that you need to do at field level. The full recommendations, of course, are in the summary of the scientific advice on pages 7 to 10. And I do want to outline that although the regulation has been adopted, it comes legally into force in August 2026. Now, that's not to say that I wouldn't actively encourage you all to start practicing these from now, because these are prudent steps that will increase the fight against antimicrobial resistance and help us do a better job. But I would acknowledge that legally they come into force in August 2026. So just some take-home messages in the last couple of slides. First of all, we have to acknowledge that this current advice and what's in the regulation is based on the current state of knowledge. And everybody has to accept that if new scientific information comes to light, it may well be that there will be a change in this regulation. The regulation, as I said, is legally enforceable from August 2026. Clearly as well, once the list for the food-producing aquatic species and the exercise for the essential list for equidae are completed and the advice accepted, once those implementing acts are adopted, the regulation will be updated to take on board aquatic species and the essential list for equidae. When people ask, how do I know what's available in other member states? Of course, that's always difficult. But to try and solve that problem, if you interrogate the Union product database, you can see what veterinary medicinal products and human products are authorized in different member states, what the indications are. So at least you can see what other potential alternatives are available to you if you encounter a problem. Finally, then, just 3 other take-home messages, and one very important for those involved in food animal production and veterinary medicine. You have to be very clear about the emerald status of the substance. There is no question of using something under the cascade if it doesn't have an MRL. And again, bearing in mind that the cascade provision is under your direct responsibility. So please ensure that you check the MRL status. A common question that arises is people ask, well, what if I do bring in a product, it's a veterinary medicine for a food producing species, and I find that there is a withdrawal period on the SPC or the package leaflet that is maybe different to what applies to the one in my member state. To be very clear, from the legal point of view, whatever the product is you're using, whatever is in that SPC and on that package leaflet, that is the withdrawal period that applies. Okay? So it is product specific rather than member state specific. Finally, of course, if you find yourself in a position where there is no withdrawal period in the package insert for that particular species, then you must follow the provisions of Articles 115. And that is, you must set a withdrawal period which is appropriate. The bottom line is that withdrawal period has to be at least 50% higher than the maximum withdrawal period for that tissue matrix in another food producing species. So to give you an example, if the withdrawal period is for cattle and it's 4 days, you bring in the product and you want to use it in swine and there is no withdrawal period for swine, then the withdrawal period would have to be at least 1.5 times that. In other words, 6 days. That would be the minimum. You would then have to use your professional judgment whether to see it needs to be even longer than that. But you need to be familiar with the fact that if no withdrawal period is specified in the SPC or the package insert, it's your responsibility to set a competent withdrawal period based on Article 115. So without further ado, I'm conscious that I've talked for the guts of about 30 minutes, and I'm now going to hand back to Zoltan, please.
Thank you very much, Rory. And also on behalf of the European Medicines Agency, I would like to thank you and all the experts' work on the development of this scientific advice. This was a huge piece of work, and as you mentioned, this was the base of the implementing regulation. So thank you again, Rory. And now we move to the Q&A session. Again, a reminder to the audience that the session is being recorded, and it will be made available on the events webpage on the upcoming weeks, together with this presentation. The presentation will include the links to the relevant pieces of legislation. So you will be able to find the regulations and also the scientific advice itself if you would like to read a bit more about the background of this work. So the participants can ask questions via Slido, and we would like to ask you to go to www.slide.com and type #AM_cascade, or use your smartphone, just point the camera at the QR code. Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Katarina.
Well, the floor is only given to me so I can moderate the questions. So we have quite a lot of questions already in the chat, and we're going to start with this first question. Can dosage and duration adaptations be covered under the cascade? I think this is a question for you, Rory.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question, one that crops up all the time. So one of the problems I have in my vet hospital is young staff who say to me, well, I know penicillin is authorized at 10 milligrams per kilo, but I want to give 20 milligrams per kilo. And I have to tell them the harsh reality. So this is one really important take-home message as well. If it is an authorized product for that indication at a certain dose, that is the authorized indication. You can't start using the cascade unless you don't have an authorized medication for that authorized indication. So you can't ignore the fact that you have an authorized medicine. So if you're dealing with an authorized VMP that has a dosage of 10 milligrams per kilo in the SPC and product information, you're obliged to use that dose. If, however, you don't actually have you're using the cascade because there is no authorized indication, then it is allowed, depending on an evidential basis. So for example, let's say you have an indication for Klebsiella that's not in the SPC, and you do some form of maybe clinical breakpoint analysis, and you find that the dose needs to be increased. Well, in that case, because the cascade is under your responsibility, you could alter the dose or the duration, but that's only if you fulfill the requirements of the cascade. So just again, to summarize, you cannot change the dose or the duration for an authorized indication, but if you have a non-authorized indication and you're operating the cascade legally, then you could look at the possibility of changing the dose or the duration once you have an evidential basis. Thank you.
Thank you. I see the next question. Can I use a human product authorized in the country? Zoltan, can you address this one, please?
Thank you very much. I try. So basically, if you mean another EU member state, then yes, as long as this is authorized under the EU legal framework for medicines for human use. But if you mean authorized in a third country, then no, this option is not provided in Articles 112, 113, and 114. Thank you. Yes, I will try. So actually, it was mentioned partly by Rory's presentation as well. So what is important to acknowledge that only authorized VMPs from third countries can be used, and only when those products are authorized for both the same species and the same indication as well. That was the reason for initiating the use under cascade. So extemporaneously prepared VMPs from third countries are not considered as authorized VMPs, and therefore their use is not allowed according to the cascade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm gonna set up this answer as done. And I have quite a few questions here, Rory, on AST testing and on in-house lab. It's quite a few. We have quite a few. I count at least 5 questions on AST. Do you think you can dedicate a little bit more time to this?
Yeah, sure. Okay. When I said we identified pathogen identification, and AST has been one of the key steps that was going to counter the development of AMR, and it was a key part of the conditions applied. We did sit down for quite a period of time, and at the end of the scientific advice, we tried to address what's practical in terms of AST and what is not practical. In other words, what can we expect of that in the actual field to be able to do? So there's absolute acceptance out there that if it's a straightforward, simple culture of a gram-positive, gram-negative aerobic bacterium, and it's a routine bacterium with routine antibiotic susceptibility profile, you should do pathogen identification in AST. Now, some member states have got national legislation where they cover what labs are allowed to do that. In other words, whether they need accreditation or what form of legal consensus do they need in order to be able to show that. But that's not in every member state, and it's not in the regulation. So this is not governed at a pan-European level, whatever. This is a member state issue. Some countries do and some countries don't. So it is clear that we recognize not everybody will have access to an accredited laboratory. Some people have in-house laboratories, and if that is allowed in your member state, then that is absolutely fine. But could I please ask you to check with your competent authority if in fact any lab you have, whether it's in-house or the commercial laboratories that you're using, whether they do need accreditation or licensing status. And if so, you must follow that. So some AST and pathogen growth is really simple to do. Others are very difficult. And again, in the scientific advice, we recognize there are some organisms like Mycoplasma, Haemophilus, Mycobacteria, that either there is no validated culture method or they take a long period of time. And in that case, it's not always possible to do it by culture. You might do it by PCR, by phenotypic measures, by genotypic measures. And all we're really expecting the vets to do is, if it's available, you are expected to do it. If it cannot be done, if there is no accredited laboratory or it's just not done, then you are allowed to make a decision based on best practice. And that would include things like, are there epidemiological cutoff values? Do you have, say, national reference surveys done over the previous year showing that Salmonella in general is susceptible to A or B, but not to C or D? Use whatever information you can. But in most cases, when we put in the requirement for AST testing, it's because we know it is available. But we do recognize for things like mycobacterial infections, it can be difficult and problematic and not always possible. But at all means, please contact the relevant authority in your own country to see what the legal requirements are. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. We are moving now to the highlighted question. I'm going to give the floor to Christina Patterson. It's a question on autogenous vaccines. Do they fall under the cascade?
Thank you very much, Katerina, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Patterson, and I am the head of regulatory affairs here at the EMA for veterinary medicines. And yeah, that's quite a regulatory question, so I can maybe address it. And the simple answer is no. And the reason for this, I think Rory mentioned quite a few times in his presentation. When you're going through the steps of the cascade, we're always looking at authorized products, and autogenous vaccines or autologous vaccines are not authorized products in accordance with the legislation. So they're not covered by the scopes of the articles for the cascade. And the way to use autologous or autogenous vaccines is described in another article outside of the cascade, and that one deals with exceptional circumstances, and this is only following a veterinary prescription, and if no vaccine is authorized for the target species and this indication. So yeah, as I said, simple answer is no, you can't. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I think I have another question for you, and it's related with an overview of all marketing authorization holders and their products in Europe, and how to know about the delisting. I assume that this is the removal or something, resulting of an antibiogram requirement for use in minor species.
Okay, thank you for this, Katerina. I'm also not quite sure what is meant by delisting in this case, but the way to keep an overview of all products and all marketing authorization holders, again, as Rory pointed out a few times, it's to check the Union product database, where colleagues can see what is authorized for which species, for which indications, and that should then help them ascertain whether they would need an antibiogram when using products in minor species. And the reason for that is that if a certain antimicrobial is not contained in a VMP authorized for use in the so-called major species, that's also not defined by the regulation as major species, but what is meant by that is cattle, sheep for meat production, pigs, dogs or cats, then the target pathogen should be identified and an antibiogram should be performed before use in other minor species. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. The next highlighted question, I think it's a Rory question because it talks about the withdrawal period. So withdrawal time in case of using alternative problems. Swine registration no longer withdrawal time 5 days, then the bovine registration 2. Bovine product was used because swine product could not be delivered. I think it's something related, probably how to calculate because it starts with the withdrawal time. So I assume it's something with that.
No, if I read that question, I think what you're getting at is, even if you do the calculation, you're going to find out that the withdrawal time is less than the 5 days that was in the member state. Okay, yeah. So if that's the correct interpretation of the question, the answer would be very simple. Article 115 talks about the fact that what is your responsibility to set a withdrawal period when you're operating under the cascade? And it talks about minimal withdrawal periods. It doesn't say that will be the withdrawal period, and it gives you the flexibility to increase it if in fact it makes sense to increase it. So in that situation, I'd have no hesitation in saying that although the mathematical calculation could say less than 5 days, you know automatically from your own country that the product will be a minimum of 5 days. So under no circumstance would I personally give a withdrawal period of less than 5 days. So I would use common sense. And again, bearing in mind, it's your responsibility and it's a minimum withdrawal period. So scientific logic would apply in this case that I would apply a withdrawal period of at least 5 days. In fact, if not longer, because again, you're using a formulation that hasn't actually been tested in swine. So that's why people always want to build in a bit of a safety period so that you don't end up getting positive residues in the abattoir. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question on vaccines, your favorite topic, Christina. So are vaccine exempt from the import of third country rules under the cascade? What about Norway and other EFTA countries?
Thank you. Well, at least the last bit is very easy. I'm going to rely again on Rory's presentation, and he already clarified that Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein are not considered third countries in terms of the regulation, and Switzerland is. though, in this case. But yes, it's true that they're not allowed, let's say, the vaccines, that they are exempt from import under the cascade. And yeah, it's again quite a regulatory question. I'll try and then give an interpretation, but this is mainly because the articles on the cascade 112, 113, 114 cover the medicinal products which should be used outside of the terms of their marketing authorization, and that's under the direct responsibility of the veterinarian. And the articles explicitly prohibit this use of vaccines from third countries, and that's only regulated by a different article, which is 1110, which again deals with exceptional circumstances, and this is outside of the use of the cascade.
Thank you, Christina. Rory, I see a very popular question here on the middle. What if a VMP for species and indication is available, but more recent scientific literature has shown that the product is ineffective instead of recommend use of an active substance that is not authorized? Do you want to take this?
Oh, yes, I want to take it because I deal with this question at home at least 3 or 4 times a year, where, say, one of my equine colleagues will come to me and say, hey, Rory, I'm not using this in the horse at that dose because everyone knows it doesn't work. Okay, and here's a consensus statement from ACFIM or wherever it might be, and blah, blah, blah. Now, here's the truth of the matter, as I tried to point out. You have legal use of an antibiotic, and legal use is within the terms of the marketing authorization. What is also legal is if no product fits that bill and there is no indication, then you can operate the cascade. Nothing else is legal. So if there's in the SPC, it says 10 milligrams per kilo for that indication, and that's what you're treating, that's what you're obliged to do. So when my colleagues say, but everyone knows it doesn't work, first question I ask is, so have you submitted a report of suspected lack of efficacy? No, I don't bother doing that. Regulators and national authorities cannot take action unless they get reports of lack of efficacy in the field. So if there are consensus statements out there and people are saying it's based on information, you've got to report this because that's what actually drives either a referral or a revision of the dose. But in the meantime, just to be clear, to be within the legal framework, you are obliged to use the dosage and the duration for an authorized indication on the SPC. So you can't just say, it doesn't work. You've got to come up with some evidential basis that would need to lead to a change in dose. And you can't do that yourself just in your own practice. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to respond to the next question. What's the difference between off-label and use and the cascade in less than 1 minute? Can you do it?
Yeah. Look, off-label use is illegal. End of story. There's only 2 ways, again, just to very quickly kind of reiterate, you can only 2 ways use a product legally, either within the terms of the marketing authorization, or if that doesn't exist, in accordance with the cascade, Articles 112 and 113. Anything else outside that is illegal use. It was referred to in the past as off-label, it's just illegal. The terms off-label and cascade no longer appear in the regulation. So just to be clear, legal use within the terms of the marketing authorization or in accordance with the cascade. Other than that, forget about it. Off-label is illegal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rory. I have a question now for Zoltan. I assume it's, can you use an alternative product, for example, flumiquine? Well, it's not that bad. For swine, if it's not available in your country, cholestyne is an option and available, but you prefer the version for bovines. Can they use it?
Short answer is yes. So if there is a veterinary medicinal product authorized in your country for a species or for an indication, you need to use that product. But if the product is not available, you can use under Articles 112 to 114, so under the cascade. Thank you.
Brilliant. I have another one. You're going to love it. The chicken versus poultry question. Which came first? Why in the annex poultry and in the text chicken?
Yes, so I have to say that this is definitely an important and probably my favorite question. And just to understand that, this is a legal text. So I try to explain why we have poultry and also why we have chicken in the Commission implementing regulation. So basically, the context in this case is different. So we use chicken, and you can find chicken in the Recital 14 and Article 3 of this Commission implementing regulation. because here we refer to the 2019/6 VMP regulation article 4, where limited market is defined. And Christina was talking a bit about this. So according to that provision, the market of VMPs for animal species other than cattle, sheep, for meat production, pigs, chicken, dogs and cats are considered legal market. So basically, in simple words, when an antimicrobial VMP is authorized for major species, then antimicrobial susceptibility testing is not required under cascade. So this is where it was important to use the word chicken. But in the annex of this Commission implementing regulation, where we have basically the conditions, the word poultry was used because the conditions are written for poultry, which includes chicken together with other poultry species. I hope it was understandable. Thank you very much.
We have 4 minutes and we still have to leave the closing remarks to Nancy. So I'm going to give you the last question, Rory. I think this is a Rory question. And after this, we still have a lot of questions and answers. We will look into them because most of them were submitted anonymously. We cannot go back to you and respond to your question. But maybe we're going to look into all questions and see if we can add them as an annex to the presentation that is going to be published with a summary of our answers to the questions responded today and all the ones that are indeed waited to be answered. We will look into them. And we are going to definitely try to publish them in the annex. In the meantime, Rory, can you respond to this one?
Yeah. How do I prove that the performance? Yeah, no problem at all. Okay, first of all, guys, just want to point out that in the regulation, it is specifically mentioned that it's acceptable for a vet to initiate therapy while you're waiting for the results of susceptibility testing. In other words, it's your best guess that I'm going to use gentamicin for this particular infection. And if 2 days later or 3 days later, you get a result saying, oh, I was wrong, then you switch, okay? But that is actually allowed for in the regulation because that's the real world. You cannot delay treatment. But in relation to not performing target pathogen identification at all, well, we do address this in the scientific advice where we look at certain things such as if there's no method for culturing, okay? Well, clearly there's nothing you can do. If there's no laboratory within your jurisdiction that does it, that makes it very difficult. And even on occasions, getting a sample could actually be dangerous. So for example, a patient with meningitis, if you were to actually go and try and do a CSF tap under anesthesia, you might kill that particular patient. So if you can justify what either A, practically at an ethical level was not possible, or B, there is no actual validated method available to do culture and susceptibility testing, then that would be acceptable. But you can initiate therapy without the results as long as you adapt the results once those, you adapt the treatment once those results are available. Thank you.
Thank you very much to FVE, to our speakers for their presentations and answers. And thank you also to all of you. I think we have over 200 participants at one point for your active participation in today's event. I will now give the floor to Nancy Debris, FVE's Executive Director, for the closing remarks. Nancy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, very much thanks to the colleagues of the European Medicines Agency, with whom we had a great pleasure to organize this 7th webinar together. And as Zoltan said, a great thanks to you. It was fantastic to see here at a certain moment more than 200 colleagues joining, and also so many questions, so many rich and contentful question. So as Zoltan already mentioned at the start of the session, the presentation and the recording of this webinar will soon be available on the website of the European Medicines Agency. So feel free to revisit it or share it even with colleagues who might be interested. And this also applies for the recordings and the materials from our previous webinars that cover topics such as pharmacovigilance, the Union product database, the reserve list for human use only, and so on. So as said, I was really thrilled to see so many questions and so many really good questions. And unfortunately, while most were answered, not all of them, but as Katerina said, the written answers will be provided also on the website at the end of the presentation. So please come back if you ask the questions to see the answers later on. And then very last, before concluding, I'm excited to share some news with you. FVE had already a cascade leaflet, but at this moment we're updating this and it's almost ready. And this leaflet really explains in the most simple way possible, using flow charts for different species, how veterinary practitioners can use a cascade and what are also the conditions to consider. And you already could see a peek view of the flow charts in the presentation of today. So we are aiming to publish this in English by the end of the month. So please keep looking, and we also want to make some translations in the different languages, so that will follow as a next stage. And of course, once that the horse essential list is being adopted and the aquatic list developed, we will again also include them and update the leaflet. So with that, I leave you all. I thank you enormously for the participation, and I hope this webinar met your expectations and provided some valuable insights. Thank you all, everybody, and wishing you an excellent afternoon ahead.